So the first shape we need to sew it together is our triangle. And then we also are going to need our pentagons, so our 3 pentagons. So our triangle and our 3 pentagons. So one thing that you'll notice is there's kind of a pretty side and an ugly side. If you can tell the difference. This yarn, both sides look nice. But what you do is you flip it to the ugly sides and you take your pentagon like this, and each side of your pentagons and your hexagon should all have the same number of stitches. So they each have 1, 2, 3 kind of clusters on each side, and here's 1, 2, and 3 clusters on each side. So they should have the same number of stitches on each side. So you put them pretty sides together, ugly sides facing out. And then you take your tapestry needle and you thread your long yarn tail that we have on our triangle through the needle. And let me zoom in a little bit. Hopefully I'm not going to zoom in too much, so I want you to be able to see a little bit. So what you need to do is this kind of place where we slip stitch to finish off, and this place where we slip stitch to finish off, that's going to line up. And you can actually stick your finger through your chain space to just make sure that everything is in line. So you should be able to line it up just like this, and chain spaces are all lined up, everything's all lined up, right? So what we're going to do is you have your kind of outside loops and your inside loops. So each of these stitches have two, let me put my hook through so that you can see. Each of these stitches have 2 sides to it. There's the outside and the inside. Some people call it the back loop and the front loop, but because these are all facing together, I'm going to call it outside and inside. So we're going to sew the outside loops together. So what we do is you find your first loop, which for me is right here, and stick it through the center. So you can see kind of the center where the outside and the inside loop meet. Stick it through the center like that. And then find the same part on your other one and stick it through the center like that. So we're only sewing the outside loops together. And then what you want to do is make sure that your yarn tail from your short yarn tail, you're going to sew that kind of between the stitches so that you hide it. Because you can't cut it too short, you really just need to hide it. Okay, and then what I like to do is stick my finger through the chain space so that I can keep them lined up. Okay. And then we see we have this one and this one. Those two go together, so you stick your hook through the outside loop. And then again through the outside loop. Okay, so you're only sewing through half the stitch, the outside loop of both stitches. And this is a whip stitch for those of you who know sewing stitches. This is a whip stitch. So we're just going over and through and over and through and over and through. But make sure you're only doing that for the outside stitches. So next, we're going to go through this stitch and that stitch to the outside loop of both those stitches, and make sure that you have your other yarn tail kind of flat like that so that it gets sewn in. Okay. And then again, we're going to go through outside loop and outside loop like that. And now we've come to our chain. So our chain space. So it should always be stitches and chains together. So again, for this chain, we're going to go through the outside loop of the chain. And you really want to make sure that everything is lined up and even. Because if it's uneven, it's going to come back to haunt you later. and pull it tight, but not too terribly tight. You don't want it so tight that it starts to bunch or anything like that. But you want it tight enough that it's like properly sewn in place. Okay. And then moving on to the next stitch and going through the outside loop and the outside loop. And I'm sorry if this is hard to see. I'll show you on the other side too when I don't have a yarn tail. So I'm going to finish up this side so that I can show you without the yarn tail in the way, because I feel like the yarn tail is making it more difficult to see what the heck I'm doing. So I'm just going to quickly finish up this side. And then once you're all sewn together, your yarn tail from, your short yarn tail, you can just clip that at that point. And then just kind of stretch it out a little bit. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to try and show you again. But if you unfold it like this is the inside and you can see our seam. And then the outside looks like that. Let me widen it out a little bit, zoom out. So the outside will have this kind of pretty finish, and the inside will have this seam. Okay, so now we need to take our next pentagon and line it up with the next side of our triangle. And remember, pretty sides together, facing in, ugly sides facing out. Okay? So we're going to start in this chain space. So what you'll have is you'll have 1 chain, 3 stitches, 1 chain, 3 stitches, 1 chain, 3 stitches. So it's 1 chain, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 places where you can sew. And the chain space in the corners gets sewn on to 2 different parts. So you're going to have 13 places to sew total. So just make sure you kind of keep track of that. And so we line it up, pretty sides together, ugly sides facing out. And let me zoom in and try and show you this now. Okay. So remember, outside loop and outside loop. Okay. And then again, find your next outside loop. It's not the easiest thing in the world to show you. So this is our outside loop for this next stitch. And this is 2. Stitch number 2. Outside loop. And, oopsies, that's the inside loop. Outside loop. Just like that. And that's 3. Outside loop and outside loop. And that's 4. That's 5. So we're in our chain right now, our chain space. Moving on to the next stitches for 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11, 12, and last one in our last chain in the corner is 13. So that's it. Okay. So if I flip it to the outside, zoom out like this, that's what we got. We got triangles, pentagons, pentagons. Now we're gonna bring in our last pentagon and sew it to this other side like this. And I will meet you back here when that is all done. So I think I've shown you sufficiently how to sew. So now we just need to sew this last pentagon in place. All right. So all sewn together and it looks like this. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our pentagons and we're gonna sew the side, side, and side. And then what's gonna happen, so we have this side sewn together and then these two and these two are gonna get sewn together. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna kind of fold this in half like a taco. And that's gonna form kind of the boot, the toe portion of the stocking. Like that. So that's how the rest of this is gonna go. So we're gonna sew these seams together and then we're gonna bring in our hexagons and do like this. So we have one on this side, one on this side. This one gets folded like a taco. And like that. So, I mean, I'll keep showing you how to do it, but in general, that's the general idea of what we are doing. Okay, so I'm gonna take my first two sides and make sure that you have pretty sides facing in, ugly sides facing out, because we're gonna turn this inside out once we're done and have only the pretty side facing out. And we're just gonna do that exact same stitch that we were doing before. And it should always be 13 stitches. Now the chain spaces in the corners get sewn to 2 different places, which is why it's 13 every time and not like 11. But you should always have 13 stitches. Okay, so that's one side. And now we need to sew together this other side, but my sewing yarn is all the way over here, so I'm gonna take that off my hook. And it's always a good idea to at least have like more than one kind of bit of yarn that you can use to sew. So I'm gonna take another long piece of yarn and cut it. And then I'm going to thread my needle with this new piece of yarn. And actually, if I'm being honest, at any given time, it's good to have 3 kind of things, bits of yarn that you're using to sew. That way, you always have so I'm going to weave it through, but that way you always have, you know, yarn to work with, to sew with, and you'll just transfer the needle. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tie a knot. A double knot like that, and then this yarn tail I'm gonna sew it, or not sew it, but weave it in with the sewing, just like we would with these other yarn tails. So you always hide your yarn tails. But now we're just gonna do like we did before, and we're just gonna do our whip stitch in the outside loops. And sew the sides of these 2 pentagons together. And if you're following along at studiocrafty.com, there should be like a diagram that kind of shows you the shape, where all the shapes go and how they're kind of sewn together, or what sides are sewn together. So if you haven't yet gone there to studiocrafty.com, make sure you go take a look, because that diagram will probably help you a lot. if you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how you're doing this. Consult the diagram. Okay, so I've got that side sewn together. And now I'm going to do that same thing that I did last time, and I'm going to incorporate a third. So you can see these are the two yarns that I'm using to sew them together. It's always a good idea just to have 3 of those, one for each kind of side of this, I guess, if that makes sense. So what I have so far is this. So I've got pentagon, 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 and I've got those sewn together, and now I need to sew the sides of these 2 pentagons together, and it's going to form this kind of toe area of the stocking. So I'm going to cut another long piece of yarn. And just like I did before, I'm going to incorporate it and tie a knot to hold it in place, and then hide the tail of that knot in between my stitches. Okay, so now I've got all of those sides sewn together, and let me just get all these out of the way. Ooh, and looks like the sun's getting kind of harsh again. Okay, it's a little better. All right, so as you can see, I've got all the pentagons sewn to the triangle, just like this. So if you were to lay it out flat, just get all these, and there's, you know, a lot of string coming off this. Right? So it looks like this. So you have 1 and 2 pentagons that are like flattened out, laying together, not sewn down the middle, but sewn on the sides, and then 1 that's folded in half, and then sewn like that. And that's pretty much the pattern for everything. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take our hexagon, and put it in this kind of space right here. And then on the other side, there's going to be another space right there, just like that. And we're going to do that. Except this time, we're actually going to do 2. So it's going to be 4, like this. This one's not getting folded in half, actually, because we want it to curve. Okay. So let's start with our first one. And got a lot happening right now. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, let's see, pretty sides, ugly sides. That's the pretty side. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to cozy it down in there into the stocking. And I'm going to sew this together. So I have my hexagon and this side of my pentagon, pretty sides together, ugly sides facing out. And just like we did before, we're just going to sew that together. And if I have any yarn tails or anything like that that need to be worked in there, I'm going to do that now. I actually have 2 this time, so it's going to be a little hard to see what I'm doing, but just make sure that you go to studiocrafted.com and take a look at the diagram, because that's really, really, really going to help. That's really going to add some clarity to this. So I've got that all sewn like that. And now I'm going to flip it over like this. Sorry, and there's a lot of yarn tails coming out of this. So many. Okay, so now we're going to bring in another hexagon. And ugly sides together. And we're going to do just like we did before. We're going to line up the corners and everything. Get it down in there. Pretty sides together, ugly sides facing out. And we're going to sew it in place just like we did all the other times. Okay, so I've got these two sides sewn on like this. And now what we need to do is we're going to sew this same hexagon. This side of this hexagon and this side of this pentagon are getting sewn together. And if you've got one of your yarn tails that you're using to sew, just leave that in place and you can pass it, and then we'll weave it up through to where we need it next. So that's all sewn in place like that. And now we're going to bring in another hexagon. And I'm actually going to use this yarn tail because this hexagon has kind of a long yarn tail, so I'm just going to use it to sew it on. Okay. So we're going to sew it like this. So what's going to end up happening is it's going to get sewn on this side and this side. So sew it this hexagon to this hexagon and this hexagon to the pentagon. Just like that. It snuggles in there just like a puzzle piece. And that's why it's good to have a lot of yarn tails, or a lot of bits of yarn that you can use to sew. That way you've always got an available yarn tail. All right, so here's what we have so far. As you can see, the boot shape is kind of starting to form. So now what we need to do is flip it to the other side. And we're going to grab another one of our hexagons. And the way this is going to work is it's going to get sewn the front hexagon to the back hexagon, just like on this side, and on this side, and then this hexagon right here that still hasn't been sewn will get sewn like that. So all of these sides that are touching, except for at the top, get sewn together. So I'm going to start with this side. All right, so we've got this side sewn together, all these sides. The next side that we need to sew together is this one right here. Let me zoom out. You're going to get to see my ugly table. Not my ugly table, but the ugliness around my table. So we've got our boot formed, and we just need to sew up this side, not like this, but just this one side, and then we'll incorporate another hexagon. Okay, let me zoom out again. So we've got like the boot form like this, and you can open it up like this. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take another one of our hexagons. All right, So next we're going to take another one of our hexagons, and this one is going to be the one that gets folded in half. Like this, and it just fits into that portion. So we're going to sew it along the perimeter like this. So sewing this side and this side together, and then the same thing on the other side. And we'll be ready to do our next row after that. And as you can see, it's forming the curve for the stocking. All right, so I've got this piece all sewn on. And now we have one last row to do with the hexagons. And I'm going to show you the entire layout for the row. So what's going to happen is when you have this dip like this, you get a whole hexagon. So you're going to have one on the back side and one on the front side, like that. And then you're going to have this next one, which gets folded in half and wrapped around like that. And you're just going to sew like that and then up like that. So you're going to sew 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 sides like that together. And this entire top portion should be left open. So this is the only portion that shouldn't be sewn. And I'll meet you back here when that's all done. All right, so I've got it all sewn together, and it's only open at the top. Now the last thing we need to do is take our little half hexagons, and we are going to use these to sew up the top, or to kind of flatten out the top, because as you can see, this edge is kind of jagged, so we can't really crochet into it. So what you're going to do is place it in like this and sew it on just like you would the hexagon. So you place this one on, and this one's going to get folded in half like that. And then this one goes on this side. And I'm going to sew on the first one with you because there is a little bit something special about it. So because we have stitches at the top, what's going to happen is, I'll just show you with this yarn tail. So you should still have 13 places to sew, but this top portion has a little bit extra sticking out. So you actually sew these top 2 portions, these top like chains together, like this. And this is its own kind of thing. So I've got that, and now I'm going to stick this on here. And I'm going to sew it just like I would my hexagons. So I need to find my first chain, which means that these top stitches aren't going to get sewn on to this other portion, if that makes sense. So just line it up. And then sew it on just like you would your regular hexagons, but just keeping in mind that there's that whole top row that will get sewn to the piece next to it as opposed to onto these hexagons. So just go through, sew on all those pieces, and I will meet you back here when that is all done. All right, so I've got it all sewn together at the top. Let me just zoom out, get my ugly table. And that's what we have so far. So now we're going to turn it inside out so that the pretty side is facing out. And now we are going to do some single crochets on this top row. So we're going to need our, zoom back in. So we're going to need our base color yarn, and once again we're going to make a slip knot. So what we're going to do is we're going to go kind of find where these pieces join together and find your first stitch for where these pieces join together, and let me zoom in a lot. So here's where I've sewn them together, and here's my first single crochet. So I'm going to put my hook through and then put this slip knot on my hook. And then I am going to chain 1 just to secure it down in place. Right, so now I'm starting a new round. So in that same stitch where I chain 1, I'm going to single crochet 1. And then moving on to the next stitch, I'm going to single crochet 1 in every stitch until I get to the end of this piece. So that should be 13 stitches. So this is 2, 3, 4, 11, 12, and then 13, and I'm at the end of this piece. So in this 13th stitch where we single crocheted our 13th single crochet, we're going to go back in and single crochet again for 14. So now we have 14. And then we're going to move on to this next piece, and we're going to do that same thing again. So we can restart our count at 1. So that's 1, 2, 3, 12, and 13. And once again in that 13th stitch, we're going to go back into that same stitch and increase for 14, and that's going to help kind of bridge this gap. So now let's do that again. Go into your first stitch on your next piece, on your next piece. Single crochet 1, 2, 3, and 13. And then in that same stitch, we're going to go back in and increase for 14. All right, so we've just completed a round, and as you can see, we have a chain where we started. We're just going to skip that, and we are going to single crochet continuously for 2 rounds. So you should have 42 stitches now. So count and make sure that you have 42 stitches. And now what we're going to do is we're going to single crochet continuously around for 2 rounds, or 84 stitches. So just single crochet 1 in every stitch for the next 84 stitches. And I will meet you back here when that is all done. Okay, so I've come to the end of my 2 rounds, and I'm actually going to slip stitch and finish this off. Just cut a bit of a tail, and you can weave that in later. And normally we would just change colors automatically, but I want to change colors at a specific point. So now we're going to change to our white yarn, or I'm using white yarn. This color was pretty free. So whatever color you're using. And we're going to make a slip knot again. And the reason why we're changing colors like this is because I would like to start at a specific point. Because we're going to do some more single crochets, and that's not going to look too bad. But what we are going to start doing is bubble stitches, which the way they join is not very pretty. So I'm going to zoom out again. So I have the point of my boot. This is like the back side. And just find a stitch that's on this back side. So this stitch right here for me, because this is where all the stitches are going to join together. And that's where I'd like it to go so that it's not so ugly. So we're going to make a slip knot. And then just kind of lay it flat. And it doesn't have to be perfect or anything like that. Just find a stitch. Tighten down your slip knot. And then pull it through the stitch. And then chain 1 just to secure it down. And then once again, we're gonna do 3 more rows of single crochets. So we're just gonna single crochet continuously around for 3 rounds. That is 106 stitches, but if you just wanna put in a stitch marker or something like that to mark your starting place, you can do that. Or you can just eyeball it and single crochet continuously around for 3 rounds. And then once you've done that, I will meet you back here to explain the next portion. Okay, so I've come to the end of my 3 rounds, and now we're gonna start our bubble stitches. And bubble stitches look like this, right? And part of the reason why I wanted to start on the side like this is because for this red one, I didn't, and you can see exactly where I started and stopped. So that's why I wanted to start on the side. You can kind of see where I joined my rounds. So the first thing we need to do for this bubble stitch is we're going to chain 3. 1, 2, and 3. And this is how we're going to start each round. So we're actually going to join rounds. Normally I like to work continuously around. I don't like to start my rounds and join my rounds or anything like that. But for this one, that's what we're going to do. So this is going to count as our first double crochet. So what we need to do is yarn over and then back into that. Let me zoom in so that you can see. Back into the same stitch where we started our chains, we're going to go in, yarn over and pull through, yarn over and pull through 2 loops, just like half of a double crochet. And then we're going to go back into that same stitch, pull through, and then pull through 2 loops. Just like that. We're going to yarn over again, pull through, and pull through 2 loops just like that. So now we have 4. Do it again. So now we have 5. And again. For 6. And once you have 6 loops on your hook, then you're going to yarn over and pull through all 6 loops. And that's our bubble stitch. And the thing about bubble stitching is sometimes it's also called a puff stitch. I've heard it called a bubble stitch and a puff stitch. The thing about bubble stitching is this side is the ugly side. So what's going to happen is we're going to do 5 rounds of bubble stitches and then we're going to flip it over like this and it's going to show the pretty side and it's going to create kind of a cuff at the top. So in this next stitch, we're going to do that exact same thing. So we're going to yarn over and in the next stitch, we're going to pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through 2 loops. So now we have 3. Yarn over and pull through 2 loops. So now we have 4, 5, and 6, and then we're going to yarn over and pull all the way through. And then what we're going to do is for this first round of bubble stitches, we're actually going to do 2 bubble stitches. Let me zoom in again. Sorry, I feel like I'm zooming in and zooming out. We're going to do 2 bubble stitches, then skip a stitch. So it's going to go bubble stitch, skip. Bubble stitch, skip. And the reason why we're skipping that is because bubble stitches are pretty bulky. And so if every single stitch had a bubble stitch, it would start to get really wide. And then it would look like the cuff is too big for the stocking. So this stitch right here, we're actually going to skip it. Right here. Skip this stitch. And don't do anything with it. Don't slip stitch, don't chain, don't do anything. So we're going to yarn over and do our next bubble stitch in this stitch right here where my thumb is pointing. So not here, but here. So go in and make your bubble stitch. That's 4, 5, and 6. Yarn over and pull through all 6. So as you can see, we skipped the stitch and you don't really notice it in the grand scheme of things. So you're gonna do 2 bubble stitches, skip, 2 bubble stitches, skip. And at the end of this round, you should end up with 28 bubble stitches. So you bubble stitch 2, skip 1, bubble stitch 2, skip 1. And I'm going to leave you to that, and I will meet you back here when that is all done. Okay, so I've come to the end of my round, and if you count your stitches, you should have 28 of these bubble stitches. And then your last stitch is going to be a skip. So this one is the only one remaining, and that's a skip. So if you count your stitches, you should have 28. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to slip stitch into this first stitch. So here are your chains that you use to start. Skip those chains and then find your first actual stitch. And this is going to be a little hard because of the white yarn. But you can see here I have my chains, and then right here is my first stitch. This is where we're going to slip stitch. So you slip stitch into there, just like that. And then we're going to chain 3. 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to finish our bubble stitch in this first stitch right here. And that is how you start your rounds. So I'm going to finish this bubble stitch. All right, so that's my first bubble stitch. And this time around, we are going to bubble stitch in every stitch. So we're not going to skip any, we're just going to bubble stitch in every single stitch. And we're going to do that for 4 more rounds. So total you should have 5 rounds of bubble stitches, including this first round that we did. So from now on, for the next 4 rounds, you're going to bubble stitch in every single stitch, but make sure you're paying attention to your actual stitches. And that you're not putting more than 1 bubble stitch where it should go. So every single round should have 28 bubble stitches. So when you reach the end of your round, make sure that you count your stitches and you have 28 bubble stitches for each round. So now we're just going to crochet 4 more rounds of bubble stitches, 28 stitches per round, and I will meet you back here when that is all done. Okay, so I've come to the end of my 5 rounds. And I'm just going to slip stitch into this first stitch to finish off. And then I'm just going to chain 1 just to kind of really seal it shut. And then I'm going to cut a little bit of a long tail because we're going to sew this down. So right now it's up like this, and we're actually going to flip it so that it makes kind of a cuff. And then what we're going to do is take this tail that we cut and not completely sew it down, but what we need to do is thread our tapestry needle, and then I'm going to flip it back to the other side. We're going to work this piece of yarn kind of up to the top where it folds over. And then come out right where our single crochets and our bubble stitches meet. Don't pull it too tight or anything because you don't want it to bunch up. But then what we're going to do is fold it so that your bubble stitches are on top and then your single crochets are on the other side. And then we're just going to kind of lightly go through the bubble stitches and out through the single crochets. And again, don't pull it too tight because we're not really trying to like bunch it up or anything. We're just trying to kind of secure it down so that it kind of remains in this folded position a little more easily. And just go all the way around, going through the single crochets and then through the backs of your bubble stitches. Don't come out through the front because we don't want visible stitches in the front. But you're just going in through the single crochets and through the center of these bubble stitches and then out on the side with the single crochets. Just like that. We're just going to go all the way around. All right. And if you have extra yarn on your needle, just leave it there because we're going to make another piece that needs to be sewn on. All right, so now we need our white yarn and our hook. And once again, we are going to make a slip knot. And we are going to chain 17. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So now we're going to go back across and we're going to single crochet 16 in these chains, and the 17th chain is going to be our chain 1 for this round. So in this, let me zoom in for those of you who are new to crochet so that you can see what I'm doing. In this chain right here, we're going to stick our hook through and single crochet 1. Then in the next chain, we go in for 2, 3, 4, 15, and 16. So I've come to the end, and I'm just going to chain 1. Let me zoom out. So I've chained 1, and now I'm going to flip my work over like this, and we're going to go back down the other side and single crochet another 16. 1, 2, 3, 15, and 16. So we're going to chain 1 and turn, and now we're just going to do 16 slip stitches. So in this first stitch, just pull your yarn through and then pull through again. And in the next stitch, pull your yarn through and pull it through again. Just like that, 16 times. And 16. All right, so I'm just going to chain 1 to finish off, and that's it. We're all done. So you can cut your yarn. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fold this in half and use these 2 yarn tails to sew these 2 ends together. And this is going to make the loop that holds your stocking on the hook. So just fold it in half and then sew through both sides. There's no real technique for this. Just go through one side and then over and then through. So this is a whip stitch for those of you who know sewing stitches. Okay. I'm just going to tie a knot in here. I don't normally tie knots in my work, but then there are some times when I'm just like, you know what, a knot would make me feel more secure here. Okay. So now get your stocking again. And I need to rethread my needle with this long yarn tail. And then I'm going to flatten it out like this and sew this loop on right about there. So right where it's flush with the beginning of our white single crochet, so that it's on the inside just a little bit. I'm going to turn it the other way. And then I'm just going to sew it on. You can use a whip stitch to sew this in place, or you can use a running stitch to sew this in place. It's up to you what kind of stitch you want. Just make sure that you're not going through all the way to the front side. Just kind of go through your loop and then through these single crochets don't go all the way through your bubble stitches, or else it's going to be really visible. And then I'm just going to do one more row to really make sure this is secure. And then once you're done, you can weave this yarn tail in. I'm gonna tie a knot one more time because for some reason I'm just like, oh gosh, what if it doesn't stay? Okay, so now what we're gonna do is just like when we were sewing that stitch in here, we're just gonna use that same technique to weave this yarn tail into the stocking so that it doesn't come out and it doesn't show. Zoom out just a little bit more. And I have been working on this all day. It's starting to get dark outside. And then once you're satisfied that your tail is hidden, you can cut it. And then if you have other yarn tails, you can just do the same thing to hide those. Okay, and that is it. We are all done. So let me zoom out so that you can see. I have to zoom out quite a lot. There we go. So this is our finished stocking. And I've got two here. I have one more that I have to make because I'm making one for every member of my family. This one's for me. This one is for my daughter who has actually not been born yet. She's not going to be around for this Christmas. She'll be around for next Christmas though. That's how excited I am about this, that I'm making it and she's not even around yet. She's still in my belly. So this one's for me, this is for my daughter, and then I got one more that I have to make for my husband, and then we're all done, yay. And we'll have these really nice stockings, and they're a good weight too. So they're really sturdy and they should last a very, very long time. I mean, several years. I'm expecting this to last until she's 18 or even longer than that. So if you like this video, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. If you want to see what else I'm working on, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, all those places. And don't forget to visit studiocrafty.com to see what other patterns and tips and tricks I have. And I will see you in the next video.